Serafina Voss had never imagined that the night would change her life forever. She was not a princess. She was not a noble. She was simply a young woman of 24 who had come to the Crescent Blood Palace as an attendant to Lady Marin, a high-ranking noblewoman of the Northern Court. Her job was to carry a small wooden box of documents, stand quietly near the wall, and stay invisible. She was very good at staying invisible. She had been doing it her entire life. The royal mate gathering happened once every year. It was one of the oldest traditions in the shifter world, a formal ceremony where kings, lords, and warriors of the Great Wolf territories gathered under one roof, and the ancient bond between fated mates revealed itself. No one could control it. No one could predict it. When two fated mates stood close enough, the air between them changed. Candles flickered without wind. The stone floor hummed like a sleeping heartbeat. Everyone in the room could feel it, even those who were not part of the bond. Serafina had been standing near the far left wall of the Grand Hall when King Darian Ashvale walked into the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in the deep silver of the Northern Territory. His golden eyes swept the crowd the way a general surveys a battlefield, with calculation, not warmth. He had ruled the Northern Territory for 6 years and had never once been known for softness. Even his own court called him the Iron King, though never to his face. He had taken no more than 15 steps into the hall when he stopped. It happened the way everyone said it would, and yet nothing could have prepared Serafina for it. The air around her went completely still. Every candle flame in the hall leaned in one direction, toward her, as if drawn by something invisible. She felt a pull in her chest like a warm hand reaching through her ribs and pressing gently against her heart. She turned her head, and her eyes found his without looking for them. King Darian Ashvale was staring at her. The entire room felt what was happening. People leaned closer to each other, whispering. Lady Marin turned with wide eyes to look at Serafina, as if she had never truly seen her before. Even the musicians stopped playing. The bond between a fated pair was not a quiet thing. It announced itself to everyone present, and it had just announced itself now, in front of 500 people, between the most powerful king in the north and a woman no one had ever bothered to remember. Serafina did not move. She could not. She stood with the small wooden box pressed against her chest and waited, because what happened next was not hers to decide. In shifter tradition, the higher-born individual had to acknowledge the bond first. That was the law of the ceremony. She could only wait. Darian looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away. And then, in a voice that carried clearly across the entire marble hall, he said the words that would be repeated in every court and territory for months to come. I reject the bond. The silence that followed was unlike any Serafina had ever heard. It was not simply quiet. It was the sound of 500 people holding their breath at the same moment. Someone near the front of the hall made a small, involuntary noise, like the beginning of a gasp that was never finished. Serafina felt the bond snap inside her chest. It was not painful the way a broken bone was painful. It was something worse. It was the feeling of losing something she had only held for 30 seconds, and already could not imagine living without. She did not cry. She had learned very early in life that crying in front of people who did not care about you only made you feel smaller. She kept her face completely still. She adjusted the wooden box in her arms. She turned and began walking toward the nearest exit, each step deliberate, each breath measured and controlled. She had made it exactly 9 steps when she heard footsteps behind her, quick, purposeful, coming down from somewhere above. She turned. A man was descending the staircase that led from the upper gallery. He was not from the Northern Territory. His clothing was deep amber and black, the colors of the Eastern Ember Court. He had dark hair and sharp features, and he moved through the parting crowd with the ease of someone who had never in his life wondered whether he belonged in a room. He was King Kael Morrow, ruler of the Eastern Ember Court, the second most militarily powerful territory in the known world. He had come tonight as a diplomatic guest. He had no stake in the ceremony. He had no reason to be walking across this hall right now. And yet here he was. He stopped in front of Serafina. She looked up at him and searched his face for the things she expected: pity, curiosity, political ambition. She found none of them. His expression was calm and completely serious, as though he had thought very carefully about this moment before moving a single step. Then King Kale Morrow did something that no one in the hall had ever seen a king do in the middle of a royal ceremony. He went down on one knee. The breath the hall had been holding came out all at once. Lady Marin gripped the arm of the woman standing next to her. Somewhere across the room, Seraphina heard the sound of Darian Ashvale going very still. "I don't carry a fated bond with you," Kale said, looking up at her from where he knelt. His voice was steady and clear, meant to be heard. "But I carry a choice, and I am choosing to offer you mine, if you will have it." Seraphina stared at him. The hall waited. She had spent her whole life being overlooked. She had spent the last 5 minutes being publicly rejected by a man who had looked at her as though she were a calculation he could not afford. And now a different king was kneeling on the marble floor of the most important royal hall in the territory, asking her permission for something that kings never asked permission for. She searched his face one more time. She nodded. In shifter tradition, a marking ceremony was a private matter. It was intimate and slow, and done only between two people who had chosen each other. It was never performed in a public hall in front of hundreds of witnesses, while a rejected fated bond still hung in the air like smoke. Kale Morrow broke every one of those traditions, and he did it with complete composure. He placed the ember and crown seal of his house on Seraphina's wrist, a mark that glowed gold and then deepened to amber, the color of fire held inside glass. The hall erupted. Seraphina heard it as though from a great distance, voices rising, chairs scraping, advisors moving quickly toward their respective kings. She was looking at the mark on her wrist, and then she was looking at Kale, who had risen to his feet and was watching her with patient, careful eyes. Across the hall, King Darian Ashvale had not moved. His jaw was set. His golden eyes were fixed on some point in the middle distance, and the people around him were leaning close, whispering words he was not listening to. His closest advisor, a gray-haired man named Edric, had reportedly placed one hand on Darian's arm and said quietly, but clearly enough to be overheard by those nearby, "You just handed your greatest advantage to your most capable rival." Darian had said nothing, but those standing close to him would later say that something changed in his expression right then, something that looked, just for a moment, like a man who understood exactly what he had lost. Seraphina was given her own chambers in the Eastern Ember Court within the week. She was given a court title, a small staff, and more importantly, the freedom to decide what came next, entirely on her own terms. Kale made no demands. He did not expect gratitude, and he did not act as though she owed him anything for what he had done. He sent a single note the morning after she arrived that said only, "You are welcome here for as long as you want to be, and you may leave whenever you choose." She had read that note 3 times. The weeks that followed were not simple. The broken bond still ached in the left side of her chest, like a bruise that did not show on the outside. She had not asked to be anyone's fated mate. She had not asked to become the woman that 2 kings had made into a public event in a single evening. She was struggling to separate who she was from what had happened to her, and that was slow, difficult work. But she watched Kale. She watched the way he listened to his people during morning councils, not waiting for them to finish so he could speak, but actually listening. She watched the way he handled conflict in his court, with patience and a kind of measured fairness that never felt performative. She tested his word against his actions, quietly and carefully, and he never failed a single test, not once. She found herself wanting to know him, not the king, him. 6 weeks after the night at the palace, King Darian Ashvale arrived at the eastern border alone. No advisors, no guard. He sent a formal request for a private audience with Seraphina, not with Kale, not with the court, with her. Kale told her it was entirely her decision. He did not express an opinion. He left the room and closed the door behind him, and Seraphina sat with the request for a full hour before she agreed to it. Darian looked different when she saw him. Not diminished. He was still the same broad-shouldered, composed man from the hall, but he carried himself with something he had not carried before. It took her a moment to identify it. It was the look of a person who was doing something that cost them, and doing it anyway. He did not make excuses, he explained. His territory was bound by a political agreement that had been in place for 40 years, requiring that the mate of the northern king come from one of 4 specific noble bloodlines. A common-born fated mate would have broken that agreement and triggered a succession conflict that his advisors believed would lead to a war. A real one, with real casualties, involving people who had nothing to do with him or with her. He had done a calculation. He had decided that the bond was the acceptable loss. "I know that does not make it right," he said. "I am not asking you to forgive me. I came because you deserve to understand what happened and why." Serafina was quiet for a long time. "It was still because of me," she said at last, without anger. "Everything you described, your agreement, your calculation, your decision, it was all because of me specifically. You decided I was not worth the cost of keeping. That is the truth of it, even if the reasons behind it were large." She paused. "I am glad you came and told me. I needed to hear it, but knowing the reason does not change what was lost." She stood up. She thanked him for making the journey. She showed him to the door. She stood in the hallway for a while after he left, not crying, not angry, just quiet. Then she walked to the window at the end of the corridor that looked out over the amber stone courtyard of the Eastern Ember Court, and she breathed in the cool evening air, and she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for 6 weeks. She told Cale that evening that she wanted to stay, not because she was grateful, not because she had nowhere else to go. She wanted to stay because she had watched him for 6 weeks and decided that she liked the person he was. She wanted to know him better. She wanted to find out who she was inside a place where she was not invisible and where no one was asking her to be less than she was. Cale looked at her for a moment across the small wooden table where they had been sitting with 2 cups of tea that had gone cold. "That is the only version of this I ever wanted," he said. What grew between them after that was not the instant golden warmth of a fated bond. It was something that moved more slowly and landed more deeply, built from honesty and small daily choices, and the kind of trust that only develops when a person keeps their word over and over again, until you stop bracing for the moment they will not. Serafina had arrived at the Crescent Blood Palace, carrying a small wooden box for a woman who never learned her name. She had stood near a wall and tried to stay invisible. She had been seen, and then dismissed, and then chosen, and none of those things had been in her hands to control. But what came next was entirely hers. She had chosen it herself, and that, she had decided, made it the most important thing she had ever owned.